Okay, so today we're diving into something that might seem kind of abstract at first glance, but it really is, it's at the core of how we think about, well, pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Value theory.
Yeah.
So we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to guide us through this.
Great source.
Yeah, it's going to be a deep dive. So if
Yeah.
you're into philosophy, if you like these kind of, theoretical, heady concepts,
Yeah.
buckle up. This is for you.
It's true. Value theory might seem kind of niche, but as the encyclopedia points out, it's actually a pretty broad term.
Oh yeah.
It's used in a bunch of different ways. So, we see it in ethics, political philosophy, aesthetics, all over the place. And then there's, a more specific way it's used within consequentialist ethics,
Okay.
where it basically overlaps with axiology.
Axiology, the study of goodness and its degrees.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, just to be clear, when someone says value theory, they could be talking about anything from like, is this sculpture beautiful to, is this political ideology justified?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can be all over the map. But for our deep dive, we're going to be focusing on what the encyclopedia calls the theory of value,
Right. Okay.
which is like the most fundamental level,
Oh.
gets at like the theoretical underpinnings of value and goodness.
Like all of it.
Yeah, it's not just about like,
Oh.
listing out good things. It's about like, what is goodness? How does it work? How does it connect to other ideas in morality and so on?
Got it. So we're going deep on this one, and our source starts off with some basic questions.
Yeah.
And it points out something I think we all kind of, we know this intuitively, but we don't always think about it.
Right.
We use the words good, better, and bad all the time. Right?
Yeah.
And the source gives us 4 examples of the types of sentences we use.
Yeah, these are really helpful. These are like really good starting points, I think. So you
Yeah.
can say like pleasure is good.
Right.
Pleasure is good.
That's like a value claim.
Value claim. Okay.
Or you can say it is good that you came.
Okay.
Goodness simpliciter.
Goodness simpliciter.
Yeah, like just good, period.
Good. Full stop.
Full stop. Then there's good for,
Okay.
like, it is good for him to talk to her.
All right. So that's often about well-being.
Yeah, a lot of time.
Yeah. Like it's good for him, for his well-being.
Right.
And then last but not least, you've got attributive good,
Yep.
which is like, that is a good knife.
Right. Good is modifying knife.
Exactly. And the question that comes up right away is like, how do these different ways of using good relate to each other?
Exactly. Yeah. It's not like we're using like totally different concepts, right?
Right. We're not switching dictionaries every time we use the word good differently.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do they all fit together? And that's a key area the encyclopedia tells us of value theory.
Yeah.
So let's jump into these varieties of goodness.
Okay.
And the encyclopedia spend a lot of time on this first one, goodness simpliciter.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot of attention, and I think one reason is, consequentialists will often point to this as like the kind of good that's relevant to what we ought to do.
Okay, so help me understand that. So like when we're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do,
Yeah.
we should be looking at like which action would lead to the most of this goodness simpliciter.
Exactly. Yeah. Like do what's best, all things considered.
Okay, but how does that relate to something being like, good for me?
Right. Yeah. It seems like two different things.
Yeah, it's like, are those on the same scale?
Right. So there's a few theories that try to bridge this. One is the point of view theory
Okay.
associated with Nagel.
Natal, okay.
And this idea is that, when we say something's good for Jack,
Yeah.
we're saying it's good from Jack's point of view,
Yep.
but goodness simpliciter is like good from a universal point of view.
Okay, so it's like if I get a promotion, that's good from my point of view,
Right.
but maybe it's not good from like the point of view of my work-life balance
Yeah. Or the universe.
or the universe, right?
Yeah.
But the encyclopedia points out a problem with this, right?
Right.
What exactly is a point of view?
Yeah. It's a little metaphorical.
Right. Like how do you pin that down philosophically?
Exactly. It's hard to give a really clear definition of point of view that would ground these different notions of goodness.
Yeah, okay. What's another theory?
Another one is the agglomerative theory,
Okay.
which Rawls attributed to utilitarians.
Okay.
And this is the idea that goodness simpliciter is just the sum total of what's good for all individuals.
So we just like add up everyone's individual good,
Right, exactly.
and that gives us like the big G.
Yeah, the big G.
But the source gives this example of a tan line, right? It's like I can say something is good for my tan line,
Yeah.
But like a tan line is not a being, you know, like we wouldn't normally include that in the sum total.
Right. It's not, a sentient being. It doesn't have interests.
So how do we figure out like which things that are good for something count towards this total goodness?
Exactly. So
Hmm.
even just figuring out whose good we're even talking about
Yeah.
turns out to be really complicated.
Already we're in the weeds.
Yeah.
Okay, so then some philosophers they try to say, okay, one of these is more fundamental,
Right.
right?
Right.
So Foote and Thompson, they argued that goodness simpliciter
Yeah.
is just like a shorthand for saying good for someone.
Yeah, that's right. Like in a general sense.
So it's like when we say exercise is good,
Yeah.
we really mean exercise is good for humans.
Right. Good for humans in general.
Right.
Right.
Okay, but that's very different from how Moore saw things,
Now, Moore maybe struggled to understand good for claims.
It's interesting.
And in his critique of egoism, he kind of attributes these really like weak analyses of good for to egoists. But, now people think that egoists don't actually need to accept those analyses.
Interesting.
Yeah, they can have a more robust view of good for.
Okay, so just figuring out how simpliciter and good for relate is tricky business.
Yeah, totally.
What about simpliciter and an attributive good?
Right, like good knife.
Yeah.
So the encyclopedia points out that we often attribute goodness simpliciter to propositions or states of affairs.
So like things that we would identify with words like that or if.
Right, exactly. Like, it's good that you came.
Right.
It'll be good if you helped.
Okay.
So Foote had this idea. She said, well, maybe being good simpliciter is just a special case of being an attributively good state of affairs.
Oh, okay. So like if I say it is good that you came, that's kind of like saying your coming is a good state of affairs.
Right, exactly.
Which is similar to that is a good knife.
Right, yeah. So in both cases, good is like characterizing something.
It's like it's a good something.
Right.
Okay, but the source mentions a counterargument to this, right? From Geach and even Foote herself later on.
Yeah, they worry that states of affairs are like too thin.
It's too thin.
Yeah, like they don't have enough to them to really support these attributive good claims.
Okay, so like a good knife has certain qualities like sharpness, durability,
Right.
that make it good as a knife.
Exactly. But like what would make a state of affairs good as a state of affairs?
Right. It's just the way things are.
Yeah, it's just a fact. It's just that things are that way.
Okay. And then the encyclopedia also briefly mentions how attributive good and good for have been used in arguments against non-cognitivist meta-ethical theories.
Yeah, so the basic idea is if non-cognitivism has trouble accounting for like the relational aspect of good in these cases,
Okay.
then maybe there's something wrong with non-cognitivism.
Okay.
Like it's missing something important about how we use the word good.
So we've looked at simpliciter in relation to good for and attributive good.
Yeah.
Now the encyclopedia gets into these, what it calls relational strategies.
Yeah.
And specifically this end relational theory.
Right.
Sounds like maybe this is a way to tie it all together.
Yeah, that's the idea. So Ziff and Finlay, they said, okay, maybe all goodness claims are ultimately relative to some end or purpose.
Okay.
And good for and attributive good are just making those purposes explicit.
So like when I say this is good for Jack, the end is Jack's well-being.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And when you say good knife, the purpose is cutting.
Right.
So the thought is, even when we just say good
Yeah.
without, specifying who it's good for or what the function is, there's still some end or purpose in the background.
And that might be determined by like the context of the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. Context is key here.
Okay.
So like, what counts as a good vacation will depend on what you're looking for in a vacation.
Right. So even these seemingly non-relative uses of good, the kind that we see in moral philosophy all the time, they're actually only like true or false once you fill in that end parameter.
Right, exactly.
Okay, but this leads to an objection.
Yeah,
I
this
feel.
doesn't seem to capture everything about our intuitions about
Yeah,
ethics, right?
Some things just seem good, period.
Right.
Not good for something.
Right.
And the encyclopedia mentions Mackey's error theory here.
Yeah, so Mackey basically said, we're all mistaken. There is no such thing as non-relative goodness.
Wow. Okay.
But Finlay, he tries to, explain away this appearance of non-relativity.
Okay.
He says it's just like a pragmatic thing, how we use language.
So it all comes down to whether we think good points to something real beyond just this relationship to an end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the core issue.
Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about these value claims.
Yeah.
Like, pleasure is good.
Right.
The encyclopedia points out something kind of interesting about these claims. They don't seem to have natural comparative forms unless you specify quantities.
Right, yeah.
So, like, I can compare two dancers, right?
Yeah.
And I can say, this one is a better dancer.
Right.
But it sounds weird to ask, like, is pleasure better than knowledge?
Yeah, it's like better in what sense?
Unless I say, like, is this much pleasure better than this much knowledge?
Right, exactly. You need the quantity.
So what explains that difference?
So this has led to like different theories about how these value claims work.
Okay.
One is the good first theory.
Good first.
Yeah, and it says that when you say pleasure is good,
Yeah.
you're really saying something like it is better for there to be more pleasure.
Okay, so it's all about this goodness simpliciter.
Right, exactly.
And this aligns with the view that states of affairs are like the primary bearers of value.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so it's not that pleasure itself is valuable. It's that the state of affairs where there's more pleasure. Right.
That's better.
That's better.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the other view?
So the other one is value first.
Value first.
Yeah. And it flips it.
Okay.
It says, no, when we say pleasure is good, we're saying that pleasure is a value.
Okay.
And states of affairs are better when they contain more of what is valuable.
So it's like pleasure is the thing, and then the state of affairs is good or bad depending on how much pleasure it contains.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so this is a debate about like what's more fundamental, right?
Yeah, it's a debate about like ontological priority.
Okay.
Like, do we start with good states of affairs and then get to values, or do we start with values and then get to good states of affairs?
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's this even more skeptical view that the encyclopedia mentions.
Yeah. Shanklin, following Finlay, he says, well, maybe value claims aren't really a separate kind of claim at all.
Oh, okay.
Maybe they're just elliptical good for sentences.
Okay.
So like pleasure is good for someone to experience. Right. And we're just leaving out the someone and the to experience.
Exactly, yeah. And that could explain why they don't have these comparative forms.
All right, that's an interesting way to like sidestep the whole debate.
Right.
Now let's move on to the relationship between good, better, and bad.
Okay.
Seems pretty natural to think about it like taller, and tallest.
Yeah, like the comparative is basic.
Right. So if you're taller than average, you're tall.
Exactly, yeah.
But the encyclopedia says that moral philosophy often flips this, right?
Yeah, they tend to treat good as the basic one.
Okay, why is that? Does that cause problems?
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, if you tried to understand better just in terms of good, you run into trouble.
Okay.
So think about sprinters.
Okay, sprinters.
John is a better sprinter than Jan.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily because John has more of, like, the quality of good sprinter than Jan.
Right. They could both be really good.
Right. They could both be excellent.
Yeah.
So maybe better than is actually the more basic concept.
Okay, so even though, like, good seems like the simpler word,
Right.
maybe better is actually doing the heavy lifting.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Philosophically speaking.
So then the encyclopedia introduces this idea of value as, like, this underlying thing that could explain both.
Yeah.
So we think of value like height,
Yeah.
then better just means having more value.
Exactly, yeah. More value than.
Okay.
But the source points out this doesn't work so well for attributive good.
Right. Does a better can opener have more can opener value?
Right. It just sounds weird.
And then there's this example of scary movies.
Yeah.
Just because one horror movie is scarier than another doesn't mean it has more of this like measurable thing called scariness.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So better than might not always be about having more of something.
Okay.
It could be about something else.
Okay, so then what about good and bad?
Right.
So better is just the opposite of worse.
Right.
So maybe if good just means better than some threshold
Yeah.
and bad means worse than that threshold, then maybe understanding better than gets us everything we need there.
Right. That's one way to go.
Okay, but there's this intuition, right?
Yeah.
A lot of philosophers have it,
Yeah.
that something is missing if we just focus on better than and worse than.
Right. Like we need to say something about what good itself is.
Right, like what it means for something to be good.
Exactly.
So the encyclopedia suggests that this might be because of the context dependence of good.
Right.
So if good always implies some comparison class or standard,
Yeah.
which might be set by the context,
Right.
then just knowing all the better than facts isn't enough.
Exactly. We need to know, like, what are we comparing to? What's the standard?
Okay. So the context is setting, like the bar for what counts as good.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Now, the encyclopedia moves into these traditional questions in axiology. And the focus here is on figuring out, like, what things are good, how good are they, and how do they relate to each other.
Right.
And the first big topic is intrinsic value.
Yeah.
So the key distinction is between intrinsic and instrumental value.
Right.
And instrumental value is pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah. It's good as a means to something else.
Like money.
Classic example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good because you can use it to get other things that are good.
Exactly.
So what about intrinsic value? What makes something intrinsically good?
So intrinsically, good things are good in themselves,
Okay.
not just as a means to something else.
Okay.
And philosophers have often thought that this is tied to intrinsic properties.
So it's like something is good because of its inherent qualities.
Right, exactly.
But the source says this link between intrinsic value and intrinsic properties is controversial. Why is that?
Yeah, so a lot of philosophers think that something can be valuable not just because of its properties,
Yeah.
but also because of its relationships to other things. So the encyclopedia mentions these terms, telic or final value,
Okay.
which are sometimes used as alternatives to intrinsic,
Okay.
to capture this idea that something can be good not as a means to an end,
Yeah.
but not necessarily just because of its properties.
So like a beautiful sunset.
Yeah, maybe it's finally valuable because of our experience of it.
Right, which is a relationship between us and the sunset.
Right, exactly.
Not just the properties of like the light and the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia also points out that this instrumental distinction really applies to value claims.
Right.
Like, pleasure is good.
Yeah.
It doesn't really fit with attributive good.
Right, like, is a can opener only instrumentally good as a can opener?
Right. It's either a good can opener or it's not.
Exactly.
You know, it's not good for something else.
Right.
Now, there's this thing that people sometimes say about consequentialists,
Yeah.
that they have to think states of affairs are the only intrinsically valuable things.
Right.
Is that true?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So consequentialists, they do focus on the goodness of outcomes,
Right.
which are states of affairs.
Right.
But they can still hold a value-first view.
Okay.
So states of affairs are good because they contain other things that are intrinsically valuable,
Okay.
like pleasure or knowledge.
So the state of affairs itself isn't necessarily the ultimate good.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
It could just be good because it has these other good things in it.
So consequentialism is compatible with different views on what's ultimately intrinsically good.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. The next big question is the debate between monism and pluralism.
Ah, yes.
So what's the central issue here?
So the question is there just one fundamental intrinsic value?
That's monism.
Monism.
Or are there multiple?
Pluralist.
Pluralism. Okay.
So we obviously think lots of things are good, right?
Yeah.
But the debate is about what's good at the deepest level.
Right. Like what's good in itself,
Exactly.
not just good for something else.
Right.
And the encyclopedia gives this example of Mill and Moore on knowledge.
Yeah.
Mill thought knowledge was instrumentally good.
Right.
More famously said it's intrinsically good.
Yep.
So there's a clear disagreement.
Yeah. Big disagreement.
And even Mill himself had some internal pluralism with his higher and lower pleasures.
Right.
Like, is pleasure one thing or is it multiple things?
Exactly. Yeah. Is it one big happy bucket or are there different kinds of pleasure
Right.
with different values?
Okay. So the encyclopedia lays out three main issues at the heart of this debate.
Yeah.
The first one is this ontological or explanatory argument.
Right.
So what's the monist's position here?
So some monists say, look, if you're a pluralist, you're leaving something unexplained.
Okay.
Like if you say pleasure is good and knowledge is good,
Yeah.
why? Why are those things good? Shouldn't there be some deeper reason?
Okay. So they want like a unified explanation.
Exactly, yeah. They want one value that explains all the other values.
But the pluralist has a response to this, right?
Yeah, they can say, look, we can have a reductive theory of value.
Okay.
We can explain what it is to be a value
Yeah.
without needing this extra, like, super value.
Okay. So they're not saying there's no explanation. They're just saying the explanation doesn't need to involve a single value.
Right, exactly.
And also, pluralists can point out that there's not necessarily a difference in kind
Right.
between their many basic values and the monist's one value.
Exactly. It's just a difference in number.
Okay, so it's like the monist is saying there's one ultimate thing,
Right.
and the pluralist is saying there's a bunch of ultimate things,
Right.
but they're all ultimate in the same way.
Exactly.
Okay. The second issue is revisionary commitments.
Right.
So this sounds like it has to do with like how much these theories might force us to change our minds about what we think is good.
Exactly, yeah. So monistic theories, they have a really strong implication.
Okay.
If there's only one intrinsic value, then everything else that we value, it's either going to be that value or it's going to lead to that value.
Okay.
So if there's something that we intuitively think is valuable,
Yeah.
but it doesn't fit into that framework,
Right.
the monist might have to say, well, actually, you're wrong. That's not really valuable.
So if your monistic theory is all about pleasure
Yeah.
and you think knowledge is good,
Right.
you might have to say, actually, knowledge is not intrinsically good.
Yeah. It's only good if it leads to pleasure.
Okay, so monism can be pretty demanding.
It can be.
Yeah, pluralism seems a little more flexible.
Yeah, pluralists can just add to their list.
Right. If something seems good and it doesn't fit, they can just be like, okay, well, now we have two ultimate goods.
Exactly.
The monist has to do more work.
Right. They got to either revise their theory or, bite the bullet and say, nope, you're wrong.
Right.
That thing's not really valuable.
Okay. The third big issue is the relationship between pluralism and incommensurability.
Right.
So this is a big one.
Yeah, this is a big one.
The argument is that if there are multiple fundamental values,
Yeah.
it's not clear how you can compare options where one has more of one value and less of another.
Exactly.
Like, how do you weigh them?
Yeah, if better than means having more value,
Yeah.
then pluralism seems to lead to these situations where you just can't say which option is better.
Like a classic example, a life full of pleasure
Yeah.
versus a life full of knowledge.
Right.
If those are both ultimate goods,
Yeah.
how do you decide?
Right. If one life has more pleasure but less knowledge,
Yeah.
and the other one's the reverse,
Yeah.
how do you say which one's better?
And this seems to support monomism, right?
Yeah, if there's just one value,
Yeah.
you've got a common metric.
You can measure everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
So practical wisdom seems to require that we can compare things.
Right.
And pluralism makes that hard.
But the encyclopedia points out that even monism doesn't automatically solve this.
Right.
Like, if your one value is happiness,
Yeah.
and there are different kinds of happiness, you
Oh,
might
yeah.
still run into problems.
Exactly. Like, how do you compare, the happiness of helping others
Right.
to the happiness of, eating a really good meal?
Right.
Yeah, they're both happiness, but they might be hard to compare.
So monerism doesn't guarantee comparability,
Right.
and pluralism doesn't necessarily doom us to incomparability.
Exactly. It's more complicated than that.
Okay, let's dig into incommensurability and incomparability a bit more.
Okay.
So the encyclopedia says there are a few different issues lumped.